Preston Stewart is a highly successful YouTube host who makes videos about the military, national security, and foreign affairs. His desire is clear to make these topics more accessible and easier for the public to understand. He studied international relations and terrorism at West Point and from there entered the army as a field artillery officer. Today he calls Murfreesboro, Tennessee, his home. Just want to check that's correct and my pronunciation of it is correct too.
You got it. That was impressive.
There we go. I didn't even use ChatGPT to spell it out. Before we jump into this, please do check out the links in the description. I've got all of Preston's links there to his channel. If you're not subscribed, this is absolutely essential. I think anyone who's engaged with Ukraine as a topic and the advancement of military tech really needs to subscribe. It's a fantastic source of information, but also please do help content creators like us to keep going and doing what we're doing. So there's all the essential links in there from how you can support Preston and how you can support me in creating this content. Now let's jump in. I'm delighted. I can't believe it's the first time, but I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, Jonathan. It's an honor to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
It's fantastic. I think we have a shared fascination, which is, yes, support for Ukraine and the values that it represents, which we'll get to. But also one of the big topics that kind of shines through, and we're just having a bit of chat about this, is the evolution of modern warfare, which it's very difficult to grasp remotely, very difficult to grasp the scale of it and where our media and dare I say our political system, even if they're not opposed to Ukraine, not really perhaps understanding the sort of scale and intensity of the warfare that is taking place.
I would agree. It feels like a snapshot in history, if you will, where we have this very, hate to use the word fortunate with the tragedy that's playing out in Ukraine, but from a U.S. and really Western national security perspective, we are fortunate in the sense of being able to watch modern war play out without a cost to our, we're not losing soldiers. Our homeland is not being hit, and we have the benefit of learning from that. What is playing out day in and day out. There's been times in history where we've seen that. It feels transformational, and I hope that we're taking the right lessons away.
And this is a key thing, isn't it? Because, and I dare say it, there are some who clearly do understand it, but it seems to me there are a lot in both the administrative and military architecture that don't quite understand how transformational it is. And they don't perhaps understand that drones isn't just about a production line, about scaling a production line, but it's about an ecosystem. It's about a culture of innovation where you actually have this extraordinary connection. Not even a connection. It's almost like they're two sides of the same coin between the innovators and the civic society, as it were, and the military. And actually, the country would not have stood either in 2022, and it actually wouldn't stand this year if it wasn't for that extraordinary sort of symbiosis that's taking place there.
And Ukraine has an advantage in this sense as well. Russia and Ukraine, where this is the focus, especially in Ukraine, where the best and the brightest there coming out of their universities or out of high school. A lot of them are working their way into startups associated in the defense space. Now, it's not all about killing people. Plenty of it can be around saving lives or increasing power efficiency right now being so critical with the energy grid under such attack. We don't have that here in the United States. Maybe in the event of a large scale war, we would, but our best and brightest are moving into all sorts of different fields, finance, tech, and they're able to tap into a lot of brain power and a lot of energy to come up with these innovations that they need. So they're kind of forced into that situation, but they're certainly meeting the moment.
The other aspect, which I think is interesting, which is very perhaps not appreciated, is the sheer number of programmers and engineers that unfortunately Russia still turned out, but also Ukraine turned out. And we've got a certain issue, haven't we, in that we have outsourced certain parts of our industrial capacity in the West during those sort of fat and flabby 90s, as it were, where we decided to disarm, no longer saw, it as a threat. We've not actually got that basis of engineers, just the sheer volume of programmers and engineers. I mean, the US perhaps is slightly different because of Silicon Valley. and tech entrepreneurship, but they don't necessarily have that connection to the military, which was certainly is the case in Ukraine. Is there something that you think we could get that if we were placed in a similar situation to Ukraine, if our homelands and cities were under threat by drones? Or is this going to be a challenge to build that knowledge, infrastructure, and connectivity?
Oh man, that's the million-dollar question, and it's beyond that into military production as well. I mean, how many? What are we 4 years into discussing how we're not churning out enough artillery shells? I mean, you're talking about programming stuff that takes years and years to train somebody to get to that level. Artillery shells, they're pretty simple, all things considered, and we're still trying to ramp up that production now. And I think we're banking on the fact that if need be, and when I say we, I feel pretty confident I'm speaking for almost all of NATO. Pretty
Mm.
confident that we can ramp up when push comes to shove if we need to. But it's hard to be optimistic about that when we seem unable to do that in this, quote, training environment. So to put it in a military example, it's like a unit that constantly doesn't meet the standard in training, saying, but don't worry, when the bullets start flying, I can get the job done. We wouldn't accept it in that case. Now, there's no reason for us to stand up a wartime economy and churn out, 100 million artillery rounds a year right now because we're not going to use it. Um, but it is a bit of a gamble that we're making. I'm hopeful. We've done it before around the world. We've done it before. We've met the challenge, but it is it's a leap of faith at this point, unfortunately.
And it does look, I saw this interesting stat today. I don't think Britain is quite, unfortunately, in that either that mindset or that industrial sort of scale up phase, but Germany seems to be. It's set in the coming year to produce more artillery shells than the US. So that gives me a
Great.
little bit of hope and a recognition that actually, well, Germany's a lot closer to Russia. So this is, you know, taking on that responsibility is, thank goodness, at last. It would have been nice sooner, but at least something is happening there. But actually transforming or adopting the ecosystem of innovation, that's going to be far tougher, I think, isn't it? Because I hear that the British Army is observing some of the drone evolution, and companies are starting to emerge that are trying to be sort of hybrids with one foot in our scale up capabilities and one foot in Ukraine to sort of test in Ukraine, as Brave One calls it as their strapline. So some of this is taking shape, but it's not necessarily working its way down to the training, to the manuals, to the revolution in tactics that are required. And it's not just drones as well. It's the electronic warfare, which of course Russians have proved themselves to be very adept at.
Mhm. I think you hit the nail on the head with the adaptation. We focus a lot on the specific technology and why can't we do this thing? And the U.S. Army had a great example just within the last few months. I'm sure you saw it. They announced this big event where they used a live drone drop grenade for the first training exercise, and that was in 2025. And they got trolled across the internet because like that is outdated now. Like we caught up after that technology has passed. There's very few instances in Ukraine right now where they're using quadcopters to drop a grenade on an enemy position. So, they've come up with their own munitions. They've come up with bomber type drones, different release mechanisms, all these things. So, we focus on that, I think, incorrectly. We're never going to catch up to what we were talking about earlier. We don't have the incentive structures in place. We don't have the industry in place. And it's not realistic that we are going to stay up to date with the rapid changes in drone warfare that are literally happening week by week. I mean, it is that fast. It is unrealistic that any country is going to stay up to date with that. But the innovation mindset is something we can do a better job with, no doubt. We too quickly, I see folks approach this with, well, we wouldn't be in this situation because A, B, C, and D. And that's fine. And I think there's valid arguments there. If the US is in a trench style war with Russia, something has gone horribly wrong along the way. That is not the war we're planning to fight. But an example I would give are 3D printers. So I just made my way back from my first trip to Ukraine, and we got to stop in a few different, we'll call them drone factories, little company and battalion size workshops, and there were 3D printers everywhere. And they were using those because it's what they had. And down to again, the company level. So you're talking about 60, 70 soldiers with a dozen 3D printers for their drones. And I think the way that we would probably look at that is, well, plastic won't work for this, that, or the other thing, instead of finding ways to work within that framework, because having a 3D printer in a company command post is something we could do today and start finding ways to make that work. And it's hard. It's not an easy move. Again, Ukraine was kind of forced into that, talking about the manufacturing capacity. Like, they've got it figured out with spools of plastic and 3D printers. I think that's the type of thing we need to be focused more on, is how can we, yeah, we're not very good at that adaptation, if you will.
Before we carry on with this video, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported the channel through 2025, and all those, of course, who are contemplating supporting us in 2026. We've run many events on the ground in the UK, Europe, and indeed in Ukraine as well. And some of the images of those events are on the screen as you see this. Your assistance has been absolutely invaluable to making it happen. And in 2026, we won't be able to do this scale of activity, have this impact, or even think about having these ambitions without your help and support. There are many ways you can help. Of course, liking, subscribing, making sure you are actually subscribed to the channel, because sometimes YouTube seems to kick people off their subscriptions unexpectedly. But actually also adding comments and sharing materials around your network. It all has a tremendous impact. Now, I know many people watching this channel contribute to Ukrainian charities and do what they can, but aren't necessarily people of huge means. But if you can, if you're able to, and if you see value in this work, please do contribute if you can. We have links to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and even GoFundMe. That is all in the description of the video. Any support you can give will make sure that we can have not just the same level of impact this year as we did last year, but we can actually increase it. And the aim, in fact, is to double our impact this year, to go from reaching about 1.5 million people per month with our content, doubling that to 3 million, and also doing many more events to help support Ukraine, help support the concept of democracy and resilience. And as we know, 2026 is turning out to be even more dangerous than 2025 was, and the existential threat to democracy, freedom, Ukraine, those aligned with Ukraine, is greater now, perhaps, than it has been at any time since the full-scale war. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for all of your support. And there's some interesting economics there as well. I was looking at some of the investments that have taken place in Ukrainian sort of startups or scale-ups. And actually, when you compare that to the investment in Western ecosystems, it's just tiny still. I mean, it's really, really small. I think one of the largest investments was $12 million, which is big in the local ecosystem, but in the grand scheme of things is pretty small.
Yeah.
But that's also interesting as well, because we seem to be built into a fairly sluggish, high margin, exquisite platform kind of ecosystem. And dare I say it, the sort of lobbying interface with politicians is very much built around that kind of, large scale, large margin. Is that ecosystem now redundant in this age of warfare? Or is it going to have to radically transform to get back to something that it would see as a business model that makes sense for these large conglomerates of military, industrial, tech companies?
Now, one of the arguments I've heard against that recently is, and it makes sense when I hear it, is these they're for-profit businesses, and they've got their Patriot system, and they've got their destroyers and their F-35s and whatever it is, where there is a margin built in, they can stay operational. When you're looking at a $500 drone, how many of those do you need to produce to meet margin? And the United States is not buying those right now. So it almost doesn't make sense from a business perspective. And that's going to be a tough one to overcome, even for startups trying to get into the space. Again, who are you selling this to? If you and I sat down and decided that we were going to come up with the best UK US joint venture FPV, that's great. The US military is not in the market. And I don't know that the UK is stockpiling 70,000 FPVs anytime soon. So we're almost wasting our money trying to create that. One aspect, it would be nice if some of these corporations maybe had some departments within that I would imagine that are experimenting with this, and maybe it doesn't take the same shape, right? This is one of those revolutions potentially in warfare where I think we at times risk looking at what we're seeing in Ukraine and saying that is the exact model that it's going to be elsewhere, but maybe there's just little pieces we take away. Maybe it's more of the autonomy with unmanned surface vehicles that could be used in the Pacific, something to that degree. So it's not necessarily one to one. And I do think we're overly weighted in the big, expensive production right now. I don't think there's any chance we veer off into the less expensive, but I think there's still a place for both. And I don't know, hopefully there's some smart people trying to figure out what those little lessons are that they can take away to make our current systems even more effective.
And of course, the idea of stockpiling is almost absurd because, as you say, if it's got an evolutionary cycle where you have to either hack the hardware or the software or the frequencies at which they operate, then you have to do that every couple of weeks to still stay relevant. Then stockpiling makes no sense because you're basically
Right.
just gonna, it's a big part of trash that's not going to be usable.
And that's part of the model that we've had here in the United States for a long time is we stockpile. We have
Mhm.
large stockpiles of munitions, and then we sell those munitions to our allies around the world. I mean, a big part of the defense industrial base here in the US is built on selling these munitions to our allies. The vast majority of what we use are used by our friends around the world. So that's all built in. We all use, for the most part, the same ammunition, the same general tanks. I know there's modifications based off of exports, but it's an entirely different business model to get into some of these mass production, low cost items.
And that's something that I found absolutely sort of fascinating in your recent videos, and actually it cuts through many of them. This is the idea that we focus a lot on drones, we focus a lot on precision, but actually there's another lesson from the Ukraine war that mass is still relevant, and we're not geared up for mass either.
I don't think so. And it's still, one of the challenges we have here is folks generally look at drones as being the end all be all, but that mass takes many shapes, right? Massing fires. Today, a video came out where a drone stopped the truck, and then as the infantry dismounted, it was hit with artillery and drone dropped munitions and FPV drones. So there's multiple different types of fires massing on the same target. And I think we've tried to swap this out as well with the assumption that one of these drones, be it a Russian Lancet, a little larger, more military grade, or Ukrainian FPV, one is done and it does the trick. But that's not the case. Another, again, recent examples. These examples are coming out every single day. Like 2 days ago, there was a Ukrainian tank that I want to say took like 14 FPVs before it was destroyed. You know, um, we need a lot. Whatever we're going with, we still do need a lot, especially when you look into the Pacific theater. The targets are going to be dispersed, very long range. That's a pretty unique problem set that I think some of this would apply. But it's not a matter of having three or four super carriers or a dozen or a couple hundred F-35s. It's it's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these munitions.
And it's extraordinary, isn't it? Seeing some of the footage, or we watch the footage day in, day out, and the comparisons with the First World War are made, and now tanks don't really resemble the tanks of the last sort of 60, 70, even 80 years. You've got the turtle tanks with all the extraordinary, mesh and stuff all around them. You've got these dandelion ones with metal things coming out all angles, and they are resembling much more of the tanks of the First World War. Huge, unwieldy, slow, slightly kind of absurd.
They're wild to see. In the conversation of warfare shifting, you know, Russia and Ukraine both want more tanks right now. If somebody could snap their fingers and provide either side with 100 new tanks today, they'd grab that up. So it's we're seeing these weird modifications to the tanks, and of course you've got the commentary that tanks are now obsolete, but the two countries actively engaged in this war would take more in a heartbeat. They do have a place on the battlefield. They're changing, no doubt. We're seeing I don't know the last time I saw a tank direct fire at anything within its range. They're more and more being used for troop transport, but they're heavy and they can still sustain or take on a lot of damage. So I think that's something we're seeing a lot of right now is folks. I mean, with these drones and USVs, we've of course heard the end. It's the end of helicopters. So they're starting to hunt helicopters. It's the end of aircraft carriers, and I imagine we're veering a little bit too far in that direction. Um, but it's changing everything with how they're finding.
Another aspect of that is well, let's do the one of the crucial things that is absolutely beyond doubt there, because I think, you know, we still see videos of helicopters and they seem to have some kind of role, and various other platforms. But it is the role of drone on drone, and this is the seems to be the next frontier. We have drone interceptors that are proving to be more effective than traditional kind of air defense mounted on the back of, you know, heavy wheelbase vehicles, etc. So we are seeing the next arms race, I guess, within the context of the war emerging, and also this idea of, you know, networked semi-autonomous drones, where it's not a one-on-one, you know, operated drone, but they're aiming for a one on 10, one on 20, one on 50, with some use of autonomous features to get around electronic warfare and local daisy chaining when these things are up to sort of so they can communicate together when they're in the air, even if certain parts of the swarm are blocked. Where do you see this all going? I mean, not in the distant future, but actually this year, it seems that there's going to be significant evolutionary advances.
I think an area that I would love it if the U.S. just went all in and said, "This is the thing we're going to take away," is the interceptors. Ukraine is churning these out. There's one model that looks pretty similar across a couple different manufacturers. It's I want to say Wild Hornet refers to it as their Sting. Skyfall refers to it as their P1 Sun or Pi Sun, and it's an interceptor. It looks about like a football, about the size of a football, and you can set it on the ground and it launches vertically and then flies like an FPV. And the range is something like 20 kilometers. It's nothing crazy, but it's enough to bring down loitering munitions, recon drones, and I haven't heard its use against missiles yet, but it if it's able to get in front of it, you would think that it would be able to do that. And they're pretty cheap, all things considered. So we still are focused on, I mean, even our low cost interceptors are pretty expensive. And I know we're churning out some new models that are trying to deal with these Shahhead drones firing rockets out of helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. But by and large, the interception question is challenging because what we're talking about here are low cost munitions. And yeah, we could make a lot, but so can our adversaries. And I feel like that's the big blind spot that we're not paying attention to is we should probably be less focused on creating FPV strike drones and more concerned about how we're going to stop these things because they're popping up in every conflict. I
That's
mean,
it. And
every single conflict.
we saw the drone incursions into Europe, and they had, you know, the traditional Patriots and F-16s and F-35s going after them, and it's incredibly expensive. You know, the ratio of cost
Yeah.
to, you know, the cost the aggressor is incurring makes absolutely no sense.
And that's one that, I mean, even if we manage to avoid a large conflict with a peer or near peer adversary, FPV drones and quadcopters with dropped munitions is something that a bad actor here in the States can put together today. It's not rocket science to figure that out. And they've got plenty of videos online, not just showing them in use, but I'm certain it would not be hard to find examples of how to build them into effective weapon systems with off the shelf equipment. These interceptors that Ukraine is putting together are for a little bit larger drones, but that whole conversation about drone defense and drone interception, I think is something that there's got to be a market for that right now that could be dual use. And I haven't seen a lot in that regard quite yet.
The other aspect, and this is going to be a challenging one, is gamification, because this is what it makes some people feel a little bit uneasy when we talk about gamification of war. But when you have, you know, rapid iteration cycles, and actually, you know, you need a mechanism to allot resources, and actually what you need is KPIs. So it's interesting that the Minister of Digital Transformation is now the Minister of Defense. So this is an extraordinary kind of choice here. And many Ukrainians I've spoken to say, look, what you need is to have a merger of a form of very rapid response market economics. And you need a mechanism to allot resources, not in the space of 6 months, 18 months, a year, 2 years, as traditional procurement processes work, but you need it almost a real-time iteration. But for that, you need effectiveness data, and you need a real-time kill chain, and you need to define KPIs to be able to keep up in this. What's your impression of how that is taking shape? It's not complete by any means. And how challenging is this going to be for Western procurement models?
I think this is a good example of something that is moving in the right direction. The answer isn't there quite yet. So I'll forget the terminology here, but Army of Drones or Drone Army is the model that Ukraine stood up. And they allocated points based off of the different systems or individuals that were hit. And at one point, a few months ago, they said an individual soldier used to be 2 points, now it's 10. And they were trying to increase killing more soldiers. And what that did inside of Ukraine is there was a live scoreboard. You had to upload data with a video confirmation of the kill, not that the drone hit it, but like separate confirmation that that tank you hit is actually destroyed, or that radar has been damaged, or that soldier is no longer with us. So it came with that, and then points would be awarded, and those points could be traded into the marketplace to purchase equipment for the unit. And I think the concept there is great. The verification of battle damage assessment, holy cow, like that's hard to beat, and that is so valuable to any military. I mean, even I was in Afghanistan with the U.S. Army. We dealt with it all the time. You drop a bomb on something and say, well, there were four guys shooting at us from in there. They're not shooting anymore. You might call up four killed in action, but then 30 minutes later, two guys run out the back. Minor, but you can see how that would happen in this case as well, where a drone goes in, you think it impacts, but maybe it doesn't detonate. Is that a vehicle full of dead Russian soldiers, or are they continuing to do the objective? And you get that wrong enough times, it really skews how you think things are playing out on the battlefield. So being able to capture battle damage assessments and measure those by unit is hugely important. And I hope that's something we take away from all of this. I know one of the challenges that I've heard from some in Ukraine is that some drone components are better than others. Some drones are better than others. So they quickly ran out of all the good stuff. So the guys they knock it out on the leaderboard, but then everybody was using all of their points to buy the best equipment. Nobody wants the fourth best FPV. So a bit of a shortfall in that, I guess maybe a good takeaway there is, again, this is another piece. You're allowing the soldiers to vote, essentially. That controller doesn't work as well as this controller. That warhead is not as effective as this warhead. Again, there's some really valuable feedback in that we don't really have set up in any way, shape, or form. So there's a lot of positive there, but not unexpected. In the middle of a war, there's still some kinks there to be worked out.
And that demonstrable performance is especially true, and it would be true, as you say, even if people are not disingenuous, there'll be a tendency to over-report the impact. But actually, the other thing that's playing out in the Ukrainian army is the battle between the more effective regiments, the more modern ones, the ones that see the need to move beyond, say, sort of Soviet mindset. And there are still many units that are led by Soviet-trained officers who, dare I say, are averse to innovation and don't necessarily let ideas bubble up. Rather, their instinct and their training is to suppress that kind of stuff. Now, if you didn't have that validation of the kill chain, you would have this systemic bias towards those who are more likely to intentionally inflate their kills. So this seems like an incredibly important mechanism to build into the system.
Important, and it made me think of something we were talking about just before we hit record about the gathering of information when you're in person interacting with these folks. And something I took away from that is, yes, there is still a Soviet mindset that they're battling back against, and the challenge is it's the older officers, so it tends to be the ones with more authority. So you're kind of fighting back against the system in a lot of ways. The younger ones coming in, for the most part, tend to be much more innovative and collaborative, stuff like that, like we would expect in a Western military. But even then, there's still a little bit of this kind of, I'm going to call it a Soviet mindset. I don't know if that's necessarily what it is, but not a lot of crosstalk between units. So we were interacting with a unit operating in the same general battle space where they were using different types of certain drones, we'll say. And they weren't talking with each other about why each one was preferred or not in the battle space. I'm talking about like we drove 2 blocks down the street. So not halfway across the front. It was guys that probably passed each other on their way to lunch, but there was enough competition there, maybe. My understanding is there is a concern that some units might have leaks and you don't want to give information, whether that's valid or not. But then there's a degree of competition of you want to outdo the guys next to you, and that can come at a cost. Now, in speaking up the chain a little bit with some of the drone manufacturers, they are collating that data and gathering it and finding out best practices. And they're not having to say, well, Preston figured this out and Jonathan actually likes this method, but they use that then to refine their systems. So it does work its way out a little bit, but in terms of kind of having to push back against the system, you think it'd probably be beneficial if the units side by side across the front were really sharing what was working and what wasn't.
And of course, maybe they're putting up barriers because they don't want some of the bad habits as they see it sort of bleeding through from other units. At first, I thought this sort of distrust was really, tear down those barriers. But now I realize that many of the more, let's say, progressive units like Kharkiv, Azov, and Third Assault Corps, they don't want what they're achieving to be diluted. They want to maybe transform these other units, but they don't want it coming back in and reinfecting them.
It seems like it's heading in the right direction because, to your point, you just named three of the most effective units in Ukraine right now. And those three are really leading the way in a lot of this innovation and collaboration. So I feel like it's heading in the right direction. And, I don't know. How long has this been an issue? Are we 90% of the way there, or is it just now being addressed? Because it's also something that you don't get a lot of battalion commanders making public statements about problems in the military. So it's hard as an outsider. Again, the value of being there in a car with somebody for 4 hours, they start talking about some of this. It's hard to understand if we're close to a solution there or if they've just now identified the problem. But again, when some of the top units are doing that or are in the right way, it's positive.
It seems so, I think, and there's certain things you'll hear which you don't necessarily want to make public. It's sometimes there's an impression or privileged information which is useful, but you don't necessarily want to run around and shout, yeah, this is broken, that's broken, and here's this corruption, here's that. But there does seem to be an effort to try to fix these things, and there seems to be a critical mass, certainly of understanding of the problem, and enough people to reach some kind of threshold to achieve the results. I guess be interesting to hear your impression here. I guess it's because they're fighting Russia, which is still almost a fully Soviet army. They have a certain advantage there. If they're just even partly willing to change and progress, they're fighting an enemy which is not trying to tackle this overall mindset. The trouble is the Soviet system does seem to be able to make little exceptions for innovation. They produced an extraordinary space program by creating what one academic described to me as little bubbles of excellence, where they sort of suspend to an extent the usual repression or the usual kind of highly punitive hierarchical rules. Often they'll have created closed towns or whatever where those guys are isolated from the population, but they do create these bubbles of excellence, and they seem to be doing the same in this war. If 90% of it's appalling and awful, unfortunately they have made progress in certain directions, whether it be electronic warfare, whether it be fiber optic drones. They're able to innovate and scale, and Ukraine doesn't have the absolute monopoly on innovation, unfortunately.
You're right, though. I mean, in speaking to someone recently, they share a very similar history, right? A lot of Ukraine and a lot of Russia. So I think it's impossible to look at one military and say they are fully. Of course, there's been plenty of changes since the fall of the Soviet Union, but some of that is going to persist in each military. It would be silly to say that it's only Russia and not at all Ukraine. But it does seem like the Ukrainian military has been more flexible, more adaptable, more innovative, um, faster. They need to make those adaptations, and I think we're seeing that on the battlefield. I mean, there's a reason that such a smaller force has been able to hold their own, and a part of that has been, I mean, just in the last few weeks, we have seen continued relatively large Russian armored assaults driving into minefields, getting completely destroyed by Ukrainian drones. And you look at that and say, what on earth is that guy doing? Like, it didn't work last week. It didn't work the week before that, but they're going to try one or two more times. I think there's some of that Soviet mindset there. And we're seeing that with reports from the Russian side of, maybe exaggerating progress and then having a hard time walking that back and not wanting to say that actually they didn't take that town. So they have to send more troops into the meat grinder for territory that they've already said was taken. So that Soviet mindset, if you will, the negative aspects of that Soviet mindset, I think are on both sides, but Ukraine is adapting out of that while Russia is still, I think we're still seeing it on display pretty prominently.
And it seems, and I don't want to stray too far into politically divisive areas, but it seems one of the core strategies actually that has been successful for Russia is to persuade the allies of Ukraine not to go all in. Whether it was using nuclear threats, which certainly seems to have dissuaded the Biden administration from a full-throated support of Ukraine. We don't want to start a nuclear war. This is what I'm hearing behind the scenes. It's an absolute obsession there. And you can see how Russia has really manipulated that to the current administration, where the carrot of we're almost there, peace is almost upon us, when people who actually observe the Russian regime know that that's nothing of the sort is true. But being able to sort of manipulate the narrative, that seems to have led allies to, for one reason or other, hold back from saying we got to do something to make sure Ukraine kicks Russia out. That's the only way this is going to end. But this psyop, as it were, seems to have been actually rather successful, unfortunately.
Think he's incredibly successful. It's frustrating to say the least. I think you're spot on with the assessment of the Biden administration. I think there was a lot of slow walking that. At the end of the day, all of the aid that was going to start World War III is, for the most part, now in Ukraine, with limited exceptions. The F-16s didn't cause nuclear strikes, and those didn't come from the U.S., but that was going to be one of the red lines. You remember back, offensive weapons, even offensive weapons could have been the end, and here comes nuclear Armageddon. So I think,
I mean, Russia doesn't make the distinction. The fact that European F-16s, they would see that as US
right,
supplied, frankly.
they, I do think there should be some credit given to look, it's easy to bash all of this because I think we should have done a lot more, a lot sooner. And I think we should be continuing to do a lot more than we are now. But I think lost in that is the West did manage that escalation in a sense to where the war did not expand outside of Ukraine. Now, I think there's a viable argument as to whether or not that was in the cards at all, but it didn't happen. So that was accomplished. I think we probably went a little too slow, a little too soft. But that is a long-standing psyop that Russia has, is the nuclear weapons piece. They just lean back on it every so often, and it seems like enough. Maybe enough of us think that they're crazy enough to do that, and it does the trick. I mean, it's nuclear
Yeah.
blackmail.
Yeah. And I didn't mean, the US uniquely is coerced by this. I mean, from the conversations I hear, I go to a lot of events. It seems that, the corridors of power in Europe are absolutely coerced by that narrative as well. Actually, in this sense, there's not that much difference, it seems, between all the allies.
Well, I get it because it's an effective argument. Who's going to be the one that stands up on the other side and says, yes, nuclear war? So if you're met with, if you do this thing, the response might be a nuclear war. Now I have to argue with that. Like, I think Ukraine's sovereignty is very important. I think that the stability and the strength of NATO is very important. I think the post World War II order is very important. But if I'm having to choose between, if I have to go through a nuclear war to sustain that, I might make a different choice because nuclear war is pretty awful. So it's very smart that they've laid that as we get there so quick that it kind of removes these other arguments about what more could the United States do, even just sanctions, just destroy the Russian economy. because they're so quick to jump to that, essentially making you defend, is that worth a nuclear exchange?
That's it. And then the balance of resource and whatever morality there starts to really break down. I'm fascinated by what your experience of this has been since you really started sort of diving into the war in detail. Who are your audience? How do they engage with you? How do they engage with Ukraine as a topic? Because we've recently been involved in a fundraiser for CAR Ukraine, and your effort there has done spectacularly well.
Awesome
So I'd
work.
love
Yeah.
to learn a bit more about your audience, how you interact, and how this theme of Ukraine plays with them.
The I started making content before the war. I was focused mostly on military history, and then at the beginning of the war, started trying to just share some information about. There's a big audience interested in what is a tank, for instance. I've never heard the word javelin before, so trying to meet that audience where they were and help them kind of understand the war that they were seeing play out. And it's moved on from there to more pretty regular updates about the conflict, but other conflicts around the world as well. The audience is about probably 50% American, and then the rest is broken down, Western Europe, Australia. It's an English speaking language, so predominantly um, Western Europe. When we're talking about outside the United States, peak Israel war, there's a pretty good Israeli audience because we were covering that quite a bit. The fundraisers have been incredible, man. That is holy cow. I found myself like competitive with myself, wanting to see those wrapped up because it's so cool to see people come together for something they believe in and actually take an action to get to that point. And then it's real people, and those real people can look out and say, "Thank you so much for this truck. It helped evacuate, my buddy off the line today." That has been wild. The Car for Ukraine one was incredible, awesome group over there. But the way I engage with the audience is primarily just updates as we go. Trying to be, I mean, at the same as you, trying to be as honest and forthright as possible. It's all when it's my opinion, I try to present it that this is my opinion, and just being there to help break something down when something happens. And sometimes that's stuff they want to hear. Other times it's not. And it's not stuff that I necessarily look forward to presenting. But I think at the end of the day, the more information, the better. And there's with a lot of these situations, there's a moral line, and bad information one direction or the other doesn't change that. It just keeps you well informed. And I think that's landed. I hope that's landed with the audience. And they're when given the opportunity, they're pretty quick to pile on donations, man. It is so incredibly humbling.
It's fantastic, isn't it? And Kharkiv, Ukraine is one of those really tangible ones where you see the vehicles going every week. They film every part of the process. And last January we drove some over directly there to their garage there, so we got to see the people who are doing all that work. And then you hear sometimes like the one I raised at a recent in a marathon live stream that we did back in December. Um, that vehicle lasted 3 weeks, and then it was annihilated by a drone. But the three service people in there survived with minor cuts and concussion, whereas it could have been a lot worse with a standard vehicle or no vehicle.
That's hard to come around to sometimes. I mean, you'll spend weeks, months sometimes trying to get enough money together to buy a truck. And then, hey, 3 weeks is longer than a lot of them will last, unfortunately. A little story there. We were helping the 25th Airborne with some vehicles when they were kind of holding Pokrovsk. So they were in some pretty nasty fights down there. And when we got them the truck, what they had instead of that was no truck. So they were walking to infill and replace guys in the northern sector. And they sent some videos over of, I mean, just, they're carrying 80, 90 pounds on their back, walking through tree lines, hit with Russian artillery and drones left, right, and center. So, yeah, I don't know how long that truck lasted. Honestly, probably not very long. Everything in and out of Pokrovsk was getting hit. But the alternative to those guys was walking for 9 hours through drone attacks. So, like, yes, take the truck. If it's even for one trip there and back, great. It's going to save lives.
It saves lives, and especially if they bring wounded back, it's reducing
100%.
that time. And this is going to be my last sort of question here, which kind of relates to that because you've talked very compellingly, and we've both talked to people who've been on, unfortunately, the wrong end of this, and that is what was presumed through most of the wars of the 20th century was a kind of a golden hour, which was the time you could be evacuated from the front with potentially serious life-threatening injuries. You could be treated, perhaps at the front to stabilize you, and then you could have some rapid evacuation. It seems that has certainly broken down and the capability of doing that. But it raises the wider question. If certain aspects of this drone war are transitory, are there other things that are going to turn out to be permanent? And is one of this, rapid evacuation from the front, is this one, unfortunately, of the characteristics that is going to remain with us from this war?
I hope so. We are starting to see unmanned ground vehicles used to evacuate casualties pretty effectively. I mean, I mean, you said the golden hour doesn't really exist like at all. And I mean, we can bump that up to the golden 6, 7, 8, 9 hours. There's regularly stories of guys that are very severely wounded, having to stay in position for days before they're getting treated. So this world we lived in for the last 20 years at least, and to some degree further of, I mean, we'd have a helicopter on the ground 15 minutes after a
Even
casualty in
Vietnam
Afghanistan. Yeah.
and the Korean War had a certain mobility which you don't see, now.
It can't happen. It's been a long time since we've seen actual medevac vehicles move near the front. They're just too big of a target. My concern is, so we talked with some of these guys about, is the next step like maybe a bit larger vehicle to get some of these guys out? Because the unmanned ground vehicles can go in and carry one person out, but they still get hit with drones because they're noticed moving. They regularly bring logistics in and carry wounded out. They get targeted and struck by enemy drones. So anything a little bit bigger becomes a little bit more of a target. So I don't know where this heads. It's no doubt saved lives. People have been evacuated that otherwise would not, but it is a very far cry from a viable solution at this point. Like it's not a matter of just having an ambulance that drives itself. It has to get there, be protected. I mean, these Kazovac drones now have electronic warfare jammers and armor. They're getting bigger. And the bigger they get, the more noticeable they are and they become a target. So it is being used to a benefit. It saved lives. I don't know what it would have to look like to be widespread for widespread use.
This is it. And, just as one platform evolves, then the countermeasure evolves as well. So, we don't know where this is going to end up.
Yeah.
Before we jump off, anything you want to say to the audience, especially, I'm going to put the link to, the Christmas campaign in there with both of our landing pages in there. I know that campaign is just about to close out. It's got a little bit to go to the target, and then it's over because Christmas is done and it's called the Christmas campaign. But it'd be nice to hit the target and then have done with it. But what are you going to focus on in the coming year? How do you anticipate, your own input and support and that of your community to a Ukrainian victory?
Well, speaking of Cars for Ukraine, incredible organization, and having worked with a couple different groups, I can just speak to how transparent they are and how dialed in they are in the process. Getting vehicles to a frontline unit might sound like an easy task. It's actually very difficult, and we at times have waited months for vehicles to be purchased in Europe and driven across, and then there's a problem. So, Car for Ukraine is great. We're talking with them about a campaign for the year. We're going to do something every other month under one larger campaign just because they are very reliable, very effective, and they have my trust and the trust of the audience. So we're working on that. There's a lot of other little campaigns we'll be running through Ziggy's Paw and Ukraine Aid Operations, both really solid
Oh,
organizations.
great friends of mine there,
Oh, they're
wonderful,
awesome.
wonderful people.
Wait, which ones?
Jigger's Paw, Irina
Oh,
and
yeah.
Dimko.
How cool
Yeah.
are they? Yeah. Um, One of the best parts of the trip was getting to meet them in person a few weeks ago. So that was great. And then, Jonathan, something you and I talked about just before we started is I've got to figure out how to recreate these conversations that I had in country with people because I'm not going to be going back and forth every week. But it was so incredibly valuable to hear what so many different people had to say. I've got to find a way to to be able to do that more. I don't know if it's long calls with these guys or what, but they're busy is part of the problem, right? They don't want to sit down and just shoot it for a while. So that's going to be the focus this year.
That's a real challenge, isn't it? And if it's public, that becomes a problem because you need permission from the comms officer of a battalion. They need to know in advance what's going to be discussed. You can't be too critical, as you said earlier. Even if you want to be, I've only seen one person be absolutely scathing about the reforms that are required in the military, and he was pretty senior. So you go below those ranks, and people just don't. He was a battalion commander, so below that, people are just they need to go through the chain of command. It's quite difficult to put those things on public record.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll figure it out.
We'll get there. We'll get there. I'm so grateful you could join us, share that with the audience, and hopefully, some of your audience will come and sort of discover the channel as a result too. Thank you so much for everything you do, and thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Jonathan.
I'm proud to say that this series is supported by The Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Bucha massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
The Ukrainian people are very resourceful and they're very determined, and they've got a very good reason to be determined. You know, Russia wants to exterminate the Ukrainian nation and just enslave it and absorb it. So they've got every reason to do everything necessary to win this war.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.